Los Angeles doesn't sleep easy in the summer of 1967. The streets outside are loud with cars and neon, but inside the Grand Olympic Auditorium, something older than the city itself is waiting. Something that smells like sweat, chalk, and fear. This building has seen everything: boxing legends, wrestling wars, riots that spilled out into the parking lot. But nothing has ever walked through its doors like the man they're about to bring out tonight. They call him the Monster. Nobody uses his real name anymore. 500 pounds of him, a neck wider than most men's waists, hands that could close around a skull like it was an orange. He doesn't talk much. He doesn't need to. His silence does the threatening for him. The promoters didn't build this show around a fight. They built it around a dare. A challenge so outrageous that it spread through gyms and dojos and backyard boxing clubs faster than any advertisement could. The rule is simple, almost insulting in how simple it is. Survive 10 seconds in the ring with the Monster and walk away with $80,000. That's not pocket change in 1967. That's a house. That's a life rebuilt. That's generational money for a family that's been scraping by on factory wages. 10 seconds. That's all. A blink of an eye if you say it out loud. But ask anyone who's actually stood across from this man, and they'll tell you 10 seconds feels like an entire lifetime folding in on itself. The organizers didn't stop at one city. They took the challenge on the road, 15 cities coast to coast, each stop drawing bigger crowds than the last. Word got out. Newspapers picked it up. Local television crews started showing up with their cameras, hungry for the story of the year. And the story kept writing itself, night after night, because nobody could do it. Nobody could last. 200 men. That's the number by the time the tour rolls into Los Angeles. 200 grown men, strong men, trained men, men who'd never lost a street fight in their lives, walked into that ring convinced they'd be the exception. And 200 men walked out, or were carried out, having learned the hard way that some legends aren't exaggerated. Some of them are actually smaller than the truth. The auditorium tonight is packed shoulder to shoulder, every seat sold, standing room gone within the first hour of doors opening. The air is thick with cigarette smoke curling up toward the lights, and underneath it, there's a tension you can almost taste. That particular electricity that only exists when a crowd knows, deep down, that they might witness something they'll be talking about for the rest of their lives. Ringside, the promoters are working the crowd like carnival barkers, because in a way, that's exactly what this is. Part sport, part spectacle, part blood money gamble dressed up in spotlights. They've built an empire on failure. Every man who steps in and gets flattened only makes the legend bigger, only drives more ticket sales for the next city, the next town, the next hopeful challenger walking straight into the same trap. But something is different tonight. There's a name moving through the crowd in whispers before the fights even begin. Not a wrestler's name, not a boxer's name, a martial artist. A man barely out of his 20s, lean where the Monster is massive, quiet in a completely different way than the giant's silence. The quiet of someone who has never needed to raise his voice to be taken seriously. Some in the crowd have heard of him from the martial arts circuit. A few recognize him from television, from the handful of appearances that have started building his reputation on the West Coast. Most people in these seats have never heard his name at all, and that's exactly how the promoters like it. An unknown challenger against an undefeated monster. That's a story that sells itself. Nobody in that building tonight, Not the promoters counting their ticket money, not the reporters sharpening their pencils, not the 200 men who already failed and are watching from the crowd with their pride still bruised. Nobody has any idea that they are about to watch something that will outlive every single one of them. A moment that will get replayed, argued about, and mythologized for the next 60 years and counting. The lights dim over the main entrance. The crowd noise drops into a low murmur, that specific hush that happens right before something enormous is about to happen. Somewhere backstage, the monster is already rolling his shoulders, cracking his knuckles, staring at nothing in particular, because he's done this 200 times already, and boredom has crept into what should be terror. And somewhere else in that same building, a much smaller man is lacing up, breathing slow, focused, carrying himself with a stillness that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with certainty. The ring is empty, for now.
To understand why
but
this
not for
arena is
long.
holding its breath tonight,
You have to go back. Back through 15 cities. Back through months of broken bones, broken pride, and broken dreams. Back to the very first man who ever stepped into that ring believing he could be the one to beat the clock. He was a boxer. Local circuit, a few wins under his belt. Nothing spectacular, but nothing to laugh at either. He'd grown up in a rough part of town, fought his way out of worse situations than a boxing ring, and figured 10 seconds against one big man was nothing compared to what he'd already survived on the street. He lasted less than 3. The bell hadn't even finished ringing before he was already turned around, trying to explain to the doctor why his ribs felt like they'd been rearranged. That was the first domino. And once the first one fell, the whole tour became a machine built on repeating the exact same outcome, city after city, crowd after crowd. Next came the Marines. 2 of them, actually, stationed nearby and convinced that military training was different from anything the monster had faced. Discipline, conditioning, hand-to-hand combat drills. Surely that counted for something. They didn't step in together, but they might as well have, because the results barely changed between the 2 of them. One tried circling, staying light on his feet, looking for an opening that never came. 6 seconds later, he was staring up at the lights, wondering which direction the exit was. Then came the wrestlers. This is where things got interesting, because wrestlers understood leverage in a way boxers didn't. One man, built like a walking refrigerator himself, actually managed to get his hands on the monster's arm, tried to turn that mass against itself using the kind of technique that had won him regional titles. For about a second and a half, the crowd actually gasped, thinking maybe, just maybe, this was the night the streak ended. It wasn't. The monster simply straightened up, shrugged the smaller man off like he was swatting away an insect, and put him on the canvas with enough force that the entire front row felt the impact through the floorboards. City after city, the pattern repeated itself with almost mechanical precision. A judo champion who tried to use the monster's own momentum against him, only to discover that 450 extra pounds doesn't generate the kind of momentum you can redirect. A karate black belt who threw a combination fast enough to blur, landed every single strike clean, and watched in disbelief as the monster barely flinched before ending things with a single, open-handed shove that sent him flying into the ropes. There was the amateur strongman who tried a bear hug from behind, thinking brute force might work where technique had failed for everyone else. There was the former football lineman who thought his size alone might finally be enough to compete. There was even a rumored undercover professional wrestler who'd entered under a fake name, hoping nobody would recognize him and disqualify the attempt. He lasted exactly as long as everyone before him. By the time the tour reaches its 50th challenger, something starts shifting in the crowds that come to watch. It stops being about who might win. Nobody genuinely believes anyone will win anymore. It becomes about watching how creative, how desperate, how doomed each new attempt will be. People start placing side bets not on the outcome, that's already decided, but on exactly how many seconds a man will last, whether he'll go down standing or get thrown, whether he'll walk out of the ring under his own power or need help. The number climbs. 75 challengers, 100, 150. Reporters start following the tour specifically because the story writes itself into something bigger than sport. It becomes a study in human stubbornness, in the particular kind of pride that convinces men, over and over, that they'll be the exception to a rule that has held 200 times running. Some of the challengers get hurt badly enough that they don't fight again for months. A few never step into a competitive ring of any kind afterward. The promoters, to their credit, always have doctors ringside, always stop things the moment a man can't continue. But can't continue comes fast and often in this show, and everybody watching knows it. And through all 200 attempts, one thing never changes: the monster's face. No excitement, no relief, no pride. Just the same flat, bored expression, like beating grown men in single-digit seconds has become less a fight and more a chore he performs on schedule. That blankness becomes its own kind of terrifying. A man who fights with rage, you can find a weakness in. A man who fights like it means nothing to him at all? That's a different kind of monster entirely. By the time the tour rolls into Los Angeles, 200 names have been added to a list that nobody wants to be on. 200 men who trained, who believed, who stood across the ring with their fists up and their hearts pounding, and who all learned in 6 seconds or 3 seconds or once, memorably in less than 2, that believing isn't the same as being ready. The promoters figured they'd found the perfect show: an unbeatable giant, an impossible dare, and an endless supply of confident men willing to try anyway. They had no reason to think Los Angeles would be any different from the 15 cities before it. But somewhere in the crowd tonight, lacing up in a quiet corner backstage, is a man who has spent his entire life studying exactly the kind of confidence that just got 200 people hurt, and building something else instead. Something the monster has never faced across that ring. Not brute force, not desperate hope. Precision. Before he ever set foot in the Grand Olympic Auditorium, this man had already spent a lifetime being underestimated and turning that mistake into other people's regret. He grew up in Hong Kong, small for his age, restless, constantly getting into scraps in the crowded streets of a city that didn't have much patience for weakness. His father was a well-known opera performer, and from a young age the boy learned that presence, the way you carry yourself, the way you command a room without raising your voice, mattered as much as raw strength. He started training in Wing Chun as a teenager, partly for discipline, partly because a kid who looks like he can't defend himself in a rough neighborhood tends to get tested constantly. He got tested. He kept training. By the time he moved to the United States as a young man, he wasn't just practicing martial arts anymore. He was rebuilding the entire philosophy behind it. Most fighters at the time trained in rigid systems, fixed forms, techniques passed down exactly the way they'd always been taught, generation after generation, without much room for questioning any of it. This man questioned everything. He studied boxing footage frame by frame. He studied fencing because he was fascinated by how a fencer's footwork created speed without wasted motion. He studied physics, actual textbooks, because he wanted to understand leverage and force the way an engineer would, not just the way a traditional instructor would. He believed most martial arts had become too decorated, too obsessed with tradition for tradition's sake, too slow to adapt to how people actually fought in real, chaotic situations. So he started building something of his own. A philosophy that valued directness above everything else. No wasted movement, no flashy technique for the sake of looking impressive. Just the most efficient path from one point to another, whether that point was an opponent's center line or the ground beneath them. By his mid-20s, he was already teaching. Not in some flashy public dojo either. Small, private lessons, often for people in the entertainment industry who wanted real training without the theatrics. Word of mouth started to spread. People who trained with him described something almost unsettling about his speed. Not the kind of speed you could see coming, but the kind that registered in your body a half second after it had already happened. Punches that connected before your eyes had even finished tracking the movement. He'd started to get a little bit of recognition on television. Small guest roles, appearances that showcased his physical ability more than his acting range at that stage of his career. But within the tight, insular world of martial arts, a different kind of reputation was building. People who trained under different disciplines, karate, judo, wrestling, boxing, started hearing whispers about this instructor whose 1-inch punch could knock a 200-pound man clean off his feet from almost no distance at all. Whispers that sounded impossible until you watched a demonstration yourself and realized the whispers had actually undersold it. Traditionalists didn't love him. Some openly resented the way he criticized rigid, classical forms as impractical for real combat. There's a well-known story, one that had already started circulating by 1967, about a formal challenge match forced on him by martial artists from a more traditional school who were furious at how publicly he taught his techniques to non-Chinese students, believing certain knowledge should stay guarded within tradition. He won that match in a matter of minutes. But the win left him unsatisfied, because it had taken longer than he felt it should have, and he walked away from it obsessing over efficiency even more than before. And when he heard that 200 trained men had already failed to do it, something about that story pulled at him. Not the money particularly, though $80,000 was nothing to dismiss. It was the challenge itself. The idea that size and force were being treated as unbeatable, as though technique and precision simply couldn't compete against enough raw mass. He didn't announce himself with press releases or interviews leading up to the fight. He simply arranged to be added to the card in Los Angeles, quietly, almost as an afterthought on a night already stacked with attempts. The promoters barely blinked when he signed up. Another confident man, they figured. Another name for the list. They had no idea what they'd actually just booked. Because while 200 men had walked into that ring relying on strength they didn't have enough of, or techniques built for opponents their own size, This man was walking in with something none of them carried. Total certainty in a system built specifically around fighting someone bigger, faster reacting, and more dangerous than anyone his own size. He hadn't built his entire approach to combat around the assumption that his opponent would be equal to him. He'd built it around the assumption that they wouldn't be, and that the gap could be closed anyway, through speed, timing, and absolute precision instead of matched force. As he stretches quietly backstage, listening to the muffled roar of the crowd beyond the curtain, he isn't thinking about the $80,000, and he isn't thinking about the 200 men who came before him. He's thinking about distance, about timing, about the exact half-second window a much smaller, much faster man needs to end something before his opponent's size ever becomes a factor at all. Out in the arena, the announcer's voice booms through the speakers, working the crowd into one final wave of anticipation before the next name is called. They have no idea that the next 6 seconds are about to become history. Section 4. 6 seconds that shook the arena. The announcer's voice cuts through the smoke-filled air, calling out a name most of the crowd has never heard before. There's no dramatic introduction, no long list of accomplishments read out like the promoters usually do to hype up a challenger. Just a name, and a scattered, curious ripple of applause from the handful of people in the audience who actually recognize it. He walks out from backstage with none of the swagger the last 200 men carried into that ring. No chest puffing, no shadowboxing for the cameras, no shouting to rile up the crowd. He simply walks, calm and measured, his eyes already fixed on the massive shape waiting under the lights. Compared to the giant standing across the canvas, he looks almost impossibly small.
But something faster,
The kind of
and more
mismatch
compact,
that makes a few people
thrown
in the
from
front
almost
rows
no distance
actually
at all.
laugh out loud. The kind of strike that generates force not from a big wind-up, but from perfect timing and total commitment of the entire body into a fraction of a second. It connects clean, square, exactly where it's aimed. The monster staggers. For the first time in 200 fights, the monster actually staggers. The reaction in the arena shifts instantly. The murmur turns into a roar, people rising out of their seats without even realizing they've stood up, because everyone in that building has just watched something they didn't think was possible happen right in front of them. Even the people who'd laughed 30 seconds earlier are on their feet now, straining to see, unable to believe what their eyes are telling them. But the fight isn't finished, not with mere seconds gone. The giant, dazed but far from finished, tries to recover, tries to close the distance again and use his size to simply smother the threat in front of him. It's the same instinct that's worked 200 times before. Overwhelm, engulf, end it through pure mass. It doesn't work this time. Because the smaller man isn't standing still, waiting to be engulfed. He's already moving again, using angles the monster's size makes impossible for him to cut off quickly, staying just outside the reach that's ended every fight before tonight, then closing that distance again on his own terms, at exactly the moment he chooses rather than the moment his opponent forces on him. A second strike lands. Then, almost simultaneously, a sweeping motion at the legs, not a wrestling takedown built on strength, but a precisely timed disruption of balance, striking exactly when the giant's weight is already shifted wrong, using his own mass against him in the split-second window where 450 pounds becomes a liability instead of a weapon. The giant's knee buckles, his enormous frame tilts, overcorrects, tilts further. The crowd noise by this point isn't a murmur or even a roar anymore. It's become something closer to chaos, a wall of sound crashing down from every level of the auditorium as people who came expecting the 201st repeat performance realize they are witnessing something that will be talked about for decades. The referee's count is barely audible over the noise, but it doesn't matter, because everyone watching already understands what they're seeing. 6 seconds. That's all it takes. Not the full 10 required to win the money. The fight simply ends before the clock even finishes its count, the giant unable to continue in any meaningful way. The 201st challenge concluding in a fraction of the time every single fight before it required just to get started. For a long moment, nobody in the building quite knows what to do with what they just watched. The silence that follows the explosion of noise feels almost as loud as the roar itself. That particular stunned quiet of a crowd trying to rewrite, in real time, everything they thought they understood walking in that night. And then the applause starts. Not polite applause, not the scattered claps that greeted his entrance. A wall of sound, rising from every corner of the Grand Olympic Auditorium, for a man nobody outside a small circle had heard of an hour earlier. The monster is still on the canvas. The giant who had stood undefeated through 15 cities and 200 grown men is sitting there, stunned, staring at the smaller man standing calmly a few feet away, breathing steady, not even close to out of breath. Nobody in that arena knows it yet, but they've just watched the moment that will turn a quiet martial arts instructor into a legend whose name will outlive every person in that building. The $80,000 is handed over that night, but by morning, the money has already become the least interesting part of the story. What spreads through Los Angeles, and then through the rest of the country, isn't a headline about a payout. It's a question that nobody can quite stop asking. How did a man half the size of his opponent end 201 fights of history in 6 seconds, when the 200 before him, bigger, stronger, more experienced in combat sports, couldn't manage it at all? Reporters who'd been following the tour for months, half bored by the predictability of another failed attempt, suddenly find themselves scrambling to learn everything they can about the man who broke the streak. Who is he? Where did he train? What is this fighting style that looks nothing like the boxing, wrestling, judo, or karate that had all failed the same test? The promoters, to their credit, know exactly what they're sitting on. A show built entirely around an unbeatable giant just found its most valuable night of footage. Not because the giant lost, but because of who beat him.
A few
Offers start
producers
coming
who'd
in,
caught wind of the
interview
fight through word of
requests.
mouth start asking questions that have nothing to do with martial arts tournaments.
Inside the tight, insular world of martial arts, the reaction is more complicated. Some traditionalists, the same instructors who'd already resented his willingness to teach openly and question classical forms, use the fight as further proof that his style was unorthodox, even disrespectful to the old ways. But for every critic, there are 10 new students showing up at his door, asking to learn whatever it was that just let a smaller man dismantle a 500-pound opponent in less time than it takes to read this sentence out loud. For the monster himself, the loss doesn't end his career, but it does end the myth of invincibility that the entire tour had been built around. 200 wins built a legend. One loss, against the right opponent, was enough to remind everyone watching that legends are only unbeaten until they meet the person who was never trying to beat them the same way everyone else did. That's really the heart of why this single fight refused to fade the way so many other spectacle matches from that era eventually did. It wasn't really a story about size versus size, or strength versus strength. It was proof of a philosophy. The idea that raw force, no matter how overwhelming, has a limit against precision, timing, and speed applied at exactly the right moment. 200 men tried to outmuscle, outwrestle, or outpunch a problem that size alone was never designed to solve. One man solved it by refusing to play by the same rules everyone before him had accepted without question. In the years that follow, this single night in the Grand Olympic Auditorium becomes something closer to folklore than sports history. Retold in gyms, dojos, and locker rooms far beyond Los Angeles. Exaggerated in some tellings, undersold in others, argued about by people who weren't even alive to see it happen. Some details shift depending on who's telling the story. The exact time, the exact sequence of strikes, even small facts about the giant himself. That's what happens to moments powerful enough to outgrow the room they happened in. They stop belonging just to the people who were there and start belonging to everyone who needs a story about the underdog who actually, impossibly, won. And this fight becomes the foundation stone for something even bigger. That instructor, whose name barely registered with the crowd before he stepped through the curtain that night, goes on to change martial arts and global pop culture in ways nobody in that arena could have predicted. The philosophy that let him solve an unsolvable problem in the ring becomes the philosophy behind everything he builds afterward. Every technique he refines, every student he trains, every screen appearance that eventually turns him into one of the most recognizable faces in the world. The 6 seconds in that ring weren't the end of anything. They were the opening move in a much bigger story that was only just beginning. What makes this particular story worth telling and retelling, even now, decades later, isn't really about a giant or a prize or even a single dramatic fight. It's about what happens when 200 people accept a problem as unsolvable, and the 201st refuses to accept that at all. It's about the difference between trying harder and thinking differently. Every single challenger before him brought more force, more aggression, more desperate hope into that ring. And every single one of them left having proven that more of the same thing simply doesn't work against a problem built to withstand exactly that kind of pressure. He didn't bring more force. He brought a completely different question. Not, how do I overpower this? But, how do I make his size irrelevant? And in 6 seconds, he answered it so completely that the answer is still being talked about, dissected, and retold nearly 6 decades later. That's the real ending of this story, and maybe the real beginning, too. Because somewhere tonight, in some gym or garage or backyard, there's probably someone hearing this exact story for the first time and wondering the same thing the crowd in that arena wondered the moment the applause finally started. What would it actually take to be the one person who refuses to accept that something is impossible simply because everyone before them already failed trying? The Grand Olympic Auditorium is gone now, torn down long ago, its spot in Los Angeles replaced by something else entirely. But the 6 seconds that happened inside it that night in 1967 never really left. They just kept traveling, city to city, story to story, generation to generation. The same way the legend itself started, as a whisper, moving quietly through a crowd, right before something impossible happened in front of everyone's eyes.